Thank you very much, Ian. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to get a chance to speak to this conference on what I believe is an incredibly important topic of research integrity. And I thought I'd just start by asking the question, what is research for? And it's to explore the unknown, to create knowledge and understanding, to challenge dogma through experimentation and observation, to formulate and test hypotheses, and of course, in some cases, also to end up with producing products and outputs that are of use. And one of the key features is that science cannot always be right. So there's a belief sometimes, and of course this was something that was exemplified during the pandemic, that science can give you definitive answers, but by definition, that's not the purpose of science. The purpose of science is to try to advance understanding and overturn what's gone before, or to build on it and correct it and refine it. Sometimes to go in a totally different direction because you open a new field. So science is self-correcting. It's a system that allows itself to be challenged and to be corrected to produce a new understanding and the uncertainties and confidence intervals around any new understanding. In order to believe, therefore, that what you have at any moment is a reasonable best picture of what you can understand given the current state of information, science must be, first and foremost, reliable. It must be reproducible and verifiable. It needs to be open, and it needs to be open because the procedure of challenge is so important as part of the scientific method. And it needs to be open because it needs to be complete. And it needs to be complete in terms of the ability to aggregate results from many different scientists, but it also needs to be complete in the sense that omission of data can lead to a distorting result. So reliable, open, and then of course it must be rigorous. It must be undertaken in a way that actually conforms to standards that allows you to know that what the data are telling you have come from a robust process. So if you take all of that, the reason for doing research, and then the notion of self-correcting science, challenging science, and reliable, open, and rigorous science, there's literally no point in doing it if you're going to end up with a falsehood. There is no point in even starting to do it if you intend to do something which is sloppy or deliberately misleading, and yet we know that that happens. So this question of research integrity is crucially important. And when we think about the uses and the need, culture and values must match that. And in those values, diversity is important. And I'm going to come back to that right at the end. Diversity is absolutely critical. Honesty is clearly crucial, and respect is important. So all of this is true for science generally, and it's particularly relevant and particularly immediately impactful when the science is affecting policy or outcomes that can affect the public. And so it's true right the way across the scientific endeavor, but it starts to become immediately important when it affects public health or well-being or societal well-being in terms of policy. And underpinning all of this, there needs to be trust. And as we know, trust is hard-earned and easy to lose. And so undermining any of these things in terms of the way research is undertaken leads to a loss of trust, which is difficult to regain. And I want to tackle this question of research integrity from three different angles, from three different parts of my own career, in academia, in industry, and in government, and just take a moment to reflect upon the state of play in each of those places in terms of science and research, and what lessons might be learned. So I'm going to start with academia, and I was an academic for many years. We know that there is a reproducibility crisis in some fields at least, but there is a general reproducibility issue across aspects of academic research. In 2019, the Nature survey suggested that only 43% said that their research group never or rarely condones research practices that cut corners. That's quite an extraordinary figure. So the researchers themselves are saying, we know that corners are cut. Nearly 4% of papers published between 1995 and 2014 contained what were described as problematic figures that either looked very similar to things that had gone before or had some problem that meant that they didn't look reliable. And in 2016, a survey suggested that 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments. Now, there could be many reasons for that, and they're certainly not all because the initial results were fraudulent, but nonetheless, that's a problematic observation. And there may be, as I said, legitimate reasons why reproducibility has proved difficult, but it's something that we know is an issue. And this organization, UKRIO, looked at incentives on researcher behavior and found bullying and harassment as a top factor. So we know that across academia, there are issues which are now being spoken about, which people are concerned about, which people are trying to get right. And it's a crucial area. I want to pick on an international example, which I think illustrates the problem. In countries where there are authoritarian, very hierarchical systems, and that spills over into the science structure or the academic structure and the research structure generally, that hierarchy can cause problems in terms of the ability of scientists and researchers to speak their mind, to come up with a result which differs from the desired result of the leader. And that in turn leads to a high rate of fraudulent papers, of course. So hierarchy and expectation of good results is a problem that is pervasive, and much more pervasive where you have a very strong, dominant hierarchical structure. A second general point in academia, which I think is crucial, is, and this speaks to reproducibility. There are issues around the ability to reproduce experiments which are not related to fraud and not related to intentional processes to deceive people, but are to do with the fact that experiments are often undertaken one of a kind, because you're really at the cutting edge of trying to do something, and therefore the focus on quality reproducible methodology is sometimes not as strong as it could be, and you have people who are doing something for the first time for a particular experimental result, and that can lead to problems of that experimental results not being as robust as it should be, because there isn't a quality control over the design and implementation of specific technologies. So academia, I think, is looking at this hard, and this organization, of course, has been instrumental in trying to make sure that academia does get into the right place on this. What about industry, if we look at industry? Well, I'm going to speak about this from one part of industry that I know well, which is the pharma industry, where I spent 11 years. And if you think about the issue there, integrity really has to be central to what a company making medicines does, because the output needs to be reliable for the sake of patients who are taking it. And if you get something wrong, it's not just wrong in the sense of a paper, it's wrong in the sense of potentially safety. And that, of course, is why it's a very regulated industry. But we need to be honest and realistic that the situation in terms of integrity was not in a good place in industry for many, many years. It was in a bad place. And there were many examples of incomplete data being used to present a particular picture. There were accusations of bias in terms of design. And we know that there were scandals and issues around safety. And these have significant consequences. But there was a massive change that took place in one part of the approach of the industry to integrity, and that was around clinical trials, where a number of issues had been brought up over years, and many individuals and groups wanted to change this, and open trials and the work of Ben Goldacre was certainly one of those, but there were others as well, people like Ian Chalmers and others. And indeed, within industry, there were people who wanted to change it. And if you look now at what has happened over the past 10 or 15 years in industry, it is a dramatic shift. So protocols and analytical plans for clinical trials are now published in advance so that it is clear what is going to be done and how the results will be analyzed. That is a big change. It's true for virtually all, and it should be true for all trials undertaken in industry, and they are in the public domain. The data are made public. Many companies have committed to make all of the data public so that others can go in and look, reanalyze, scrutinize, look for errors, look for things like bias in certain numbers appearing more often they should have, differences in standard deviations which look odd in terms of the trial population. Those are public, so people can look at them. And there are rigorous mechanisms to inspect from the regulators, and indeed most companies have very rigorous methods to detect whether there are anomalies in clinical trials. So clinical trials from industry have become very, very open, in fact, in terms of what you can access and how you can check them. And of course, getting that wrong has huge consequences for the company, because the drug may not get approved as a result, or the company gets a fine or gets a reputational issue. So there are a number of mechanisms which make that an imperative for companies to try to get this right. And it was not an easy situation to move to a more open picture. And I'll give you a couple of examples as to where this has changed and what that has now meant. So individual patient level data is something that becomes important when checking clinical trial results. And a number of companies decided to make individual patient level data available, with a concern then as to how you protect privacy and protect patient de-identification so that people can't identify particular individuals. And that led to a clinical study data request system set up at the Wellcome Trust at the behest of industry for people to be able to ask to see individual patient level data. There was initially a lot of anxiety within industry about this, that this was going to cause a problem. It would allow competitors to look at their data. It would create a distorted position where they couldn't have an advantage. Interestingly, within probably 2 years of many companies deciding they would make this available, I was in a meeting where major companies said how useful it was to be able to use the placebo data from other companies to understand how to design a trial. So there'd been a switch from, we can't possibly do this, it's going to be very damaging, to this is incredibly beneficial for us as well. So openness, integrity, and ability to get things into the public domain turn out, surprise, surprise, to be useful for everybody, including those who might have wanted to resist this happening in the first place. And one of the paradoxes now is that industry, in this respect, and I'll say about other respects, but in this respect of clinical trials, is actually ahead of academia. And again, individuals like Ian Chalmers will speak about this, about how there's been this sort of paradoxical shift. And I'll give you two examples from my own experience. One was a very large clinical trial which had got a negative result after 5 years, with 30,000 people in the trial who participated, given up their time, taken the risks that inevitably occur when you're part of a trial with a new medicine. And those data, I thought, would be valuable for everybody just to see the whole thing. Anybody could look at it, do what they like, look at the data, reanalyze. The block to doing that, and this is a few years ago, it would not happen now, the block to doing that was the academic investigators who said, no, these are our data. These are our data that we're going to mine for the next 10 years and publish on. That can't be right. So openness and getting data out there is an imperative, and it needs to be one that everyone adheres to. The second example, where I think, again, it just illustrates where in some places industry has gone ahead of academia, but I'm going to come back to where that's not true overall. An example of fraud, and it was a case that we had detected of fraud in the company where results were being manipulated. And when we discovered it, I phoned up the editor of Nature Medicine, where the paper had appeared, and said, we've discovered the fraud, we're going to expose it, we'd like you to issue a statement that the paper is fraudulent, and we will be making the whole thing public and dealing with the individuals concerned very clearly. The response I got from the editor of Nature Medicine was, this is a very unusual phone call, because most of the calls I get are about people saying, we found a problem, please don't make it too public. Please brush it under the carpet a bit. Please help us not make too big a thing about this. We'll deal with it, don't worry about it. So I think there is a cultural issue about being prepared to deal with these things absolutely head on and making it public as to what is going on, which is slightly missing. Now, I've said those are some examples from industry, but there are many others where industry hasn't caught up, and it's caught up in a clinical trial space. It hasn't caught up in many other spaces where things are often perceived to be of commercial sensitivity, where frankly, I don't think they are very often, and where there could be a much more open approach. And you can, again, in the pharmaceutical industry, think about things like safety results and testing in animals and other systems. You could think about things in other industries as well, where making the data open would actually be beneficial. So I don't think industry has got this cracked across the board. It's got it much better in some places. And then my third area I want to touch on is government. And I'm not going to touch on government as a funder of research, because I think that's sort of been dealt with elsewhere in the conference, and also has been dealt with in terms of some of the comments I've made about academia. But government needs research and it needs evidence. It uses commissioned research for certain areas. That might be a department, or it might be work undertaken in a public sector research establishment. More commonly than actually doing research, government needs evidence synthesis. It needs a summary of the current state of evidence, which can be used to inform policy design or operational matters. And a number of us wrote a paper on this about 4 years ago, and define some of the criteria that should be followed, which are the research should be transparent, it should be accessible, or the process rather to get to the evidence synthesis should be transparent, it should be accessible, in other words, it shouldn't use lots of things that people can't themselves look at, it should be inclusive and involve different disciplines in order to make sure the totality is looked at, and of course it should be rigorous. I want to pick up for a few minutes some examples from COVID. Very early on, during the COVID pandemic, a group of chief scientific advisors from across the world wrote a letter saying that all publications relating to scientific publications relating to COVID should be open access by default. I think that was an important statement that meant, and the journals picked up on it immediately and made that true. It meant that people everywhere could see what was being published. It wasn't behind a paywall. Early on in the UK, the longitudinal cohort studies that have been going for many years, there was a plea to make those as open as possible for people to be able to use them and access them, to be able to use these long-term national resources to understand some of the long-term effects of disease. Our own work in the Science Advice Group for Emergencies undertook to publish all of the papers that came in that formed the basis of the scientific evidence into ministers, and ultimately more than 1,200 papers were published and made accessible through that system. And all of the minutes of the meetings were made public because they were in effect the evidence synthesis that went into ministerial decision-making and policy development. I mean, it may seem obvious that this should all be public, but it wasn't the norm beforehand, and it needs to be the norm now. So in order to get research integrity, you must, in my view, make as much public as you can. And when you think about the use of a research evidence base for policy decision-making, the evidence base should be public. It doesn't mean that every single discussion between anybody in government should be public. That clearly is unrealistic. But it does mean that the rigorous, standardized evidence production that goes into a system that gives both policy generation and policy decision-making, it's helpful if those things are public. It's not a detriment. It actually is helpful. It allows the process of challenge. It allows the process of building on that by others. And it's not a threat to the ultimate policy. It provides a reason and a rationale, or indeed a challenge to where the policy ends up, depending on what people choose. But it is not a threat. It is a key part of integrity. It is, of course, important that ministers and others get a chance to think about things and are not bounced into situations, and therefore it's reasonable to say there can be a delay before publication whilst policy development takes place. But that doesn't negate the need to make this public. It's because of this need for transparency and openness in order to create an understanding of how decisions are based and a belief in the integrity of what went into that, that I was very keen for government and all scientists across government and departments to sign up to the Research Integrity Concordat. And indeed, that's happened. The principles have been agreed, and this has been now been led by permanent secretaries, by the chief scientific advisors, and Ian Diamond and the Office for National Statistics, as well as the analytical function, have all signed up to this to make sure that the evidence base, the research evidence base, is public in terms of the input. Now, again, there are other inputs that go into policy decisions, but the research bit has to be something that can be seen and can be challenged and can be added to, as we've discussed. The way that happens in government is going to be a departmental accountability, because you can't do that centrally. It needs to be departments that own it, but that has been agreed and I think is an important step. People are essential, culture is essential, and the government science and engineering profession career framework now has research integrity as a core skill. In other words, something that people need to be both taught about and understand and develop a skill in. There are values which people hold which need to underpin that, but there is a skill to understanding exactly what this means in practice. And I think that is an important move in the right direction. So let me pull this together and say research integrity is fundamental because without it, research actually has no meaning. It has a series of principles underlying it which are crucial to adhere to. And fundamentally, underlying this, there are values and there's culture. And one of the biggest dangers, I think, for the cultural side is a hierarchy where the hierarchy demands results. One of the other key areas is the need for diversity. Diversity is a key part of getting the culture right and making sure that difficult, complex problems are being tackled in a way that brings in all of the skills, all of the different opinions, and all of the diversity of background, gender, ethnicity, social class, other things that actually contribute to openness and to challenge. So diversity is not a nice to have or a separate issue. It is, I think, absolutely core to the question of integrity in research. And getting that culture right, getting the openness right, making sure that hierarchy does not impede the ability of people to say when something is wrong, and being clear that research should be open as a first principle and only not open where there are very, very strong reasons, such as national security, for something not to be open. So I hope that those sort of observations from three parts of my own career and thinking about how this relates to research integrity will be of use to those on the call.